Our message today is from Acts chapter 14, starting at verse 9. It's about being conformed or transformed. Starting at verse 8. There was a certain man at Lystra, impotent in his feet. In other words, he couldn't walk, his feet were lame, being a cripple from his mother's womb, who never had walked. So it isn't like he had an accident or something. He walked and he never walked. He walked some and then didn't walk. He never walked. Why is that important? Well, if you get your feet back after you've been injured, you might be a little unsteady on your feet, but you know how to walk. This man's never walked. So it's a much more difficult situation if you get to walk after you've never walked before. It's like, so you have strength in your ankles and things, but you still know how to walk. You still don't have that sense of balance. Anyway, verse 9, the same heard Paul speak, who steadfastly beholding him, and perceiving that he had faith to be healed. That's important. Paul is operating in the Holy Spirit here. Now he's walking around, he's doing whatever he's doing. Looks like every other day. But what you don't see is that he's in the Holy Spirit. Well, we know he's in the Holy Spirit because he said he perceived that this man had faith to be healed. You don't look and say, oh, you got faith all over your face. It's like he knew in the Holy Spirit this man had faith, specifically to be healed. Paul then said, with a loud voice, stand upright on thy feet. And he leaped and walked. So God didn't just heal his feet, he also healed him in the sense that he now knew how to walk when he never knew how to walk before. Verse 11. Now when the people saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the speech of Lycaonia, the gods are come down to us in the likeness of men. This is their context. They're used to having a pantheon of gods, a whole bunch of gods. So the way they understood it in the context that they had. It's like, this must be the gods that we think we know. And they called Barnabas Jupiter and Paul Mercurius because he was the chief speaker. Now these are Roman gods. Not surprising. Rome was the empire at that time, ruling over them. Then the priest of Jupiter, which was before their city, brought oxen and garlands unto the gates and would have done sacrifice with the people. They were ready to go. Which when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of, they rent their clothes, ran in among the people, crying out, and saying, Sirs, why do ye these things? We also are men of like passions with you, and preach unto you that you should turn from these vanities unto the living God. Turn from these vanities, these gods, Mercurius and Jupiter and all that. It's like, that's all vanity. It's just the construction of minds. Turn from these vanities unto the living God, which made heaven and earth and the sea and all things that are therein. So they're saying, okay, this is the real thing. This is the opportunity. This man was healed. Now they're talking to them about God that gave them the power to heal. Now they're going to talk a bit more about God. Verse 16, who in times past, our God, suffered all nations to walk in their own ways, like they did, like we do. Nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good, and gave us rain from heaven, and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. So even when we do evil, he still takes care of us. He doesn't destroy us. And with these sayings, with these sayings, scarce restrained they, the people, that they had not done sacrifice unto them. It was like everything, they just wanted sacrifice. But no, you can't do that. You can't do that. So now this is a situation where people would love it. A lot of people would love it, yes. I'm finally getting the glory I deserve. But they didn't go there not for a second. They said, this is absolutely wrong. You're looking in the wrong place. We're talking about the real God that healed this person. Your gods can't do that. So, what happens next? This is really interesting. And verse 19. There came thither certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium, who persuaded the people, and having stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. Wait a minute. Didn't they just call them gods? Didn't they just want to make sacrifices to them? Give them garlands, give them accolades? And now some Jews come along and talk them out of that and decide that they should be stoned? What kind of deal is that? What is going on in their heads? What is that all about? Wow, how can that happen? They saw a man healed. And Barnabas and Paul didn't say it was us. They said it was God. They didn't take any credit. They didn't take advantage of the situation. So how can the Jews come in, from Iconium and wherever, and say, how can they persuade them that these men are evil and should be stoned? At least Paul. That's where it gets interesting. These people, they heard the testimony of Jesus. They did not accept the testimony of Jesus. We know that because they stopped them from, Barnabas and Paul stopped them from worshiping them. But if you notice, they didn't say anything about embracing the Jesus that was preached to them. In other words, they didn't want to hear about Jesus. They were comfortable with their Jupiter. They were comfortable with their Mercurius. They were comfortable with what they thought they knew. So when Paul and Barnabas come along and start preaching this didn't jive with their thinking. Now when the Jews came along, it was easy to buy into that. Why? They didn't have to change their thinking. They didn't have to change their methods. They didn't have to change their way of life. It was like, they must be wrong. Why? Because I must be right. If I'm right, then they must be wrong. So then we need to stone them. Why? Well, if you really don't want the testimony, you want to kill them. Destroy it, and it won't come back to bite you. This comes back to something in the New Testament. And that's Romans chapter 12, verse 2. He says, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. What's that got to do with being conformed? People look and say, well, you're conforming by what you do. But it's never about what you do. It's the thoughts behind what you do. Why are you doing what you're doing? There's no sin that you can do in the flesh without first conceiving it and accepting it in the spirit, in your mind. So all we're seeing is actually just the last manifestation of what's been going on in your head for a long time. Your acts just simply reflect what you've been thinking for some time. So be not conformed to this world in the way you think, because the way you think is reflected in the way that you act. And if people in this world can't recognize that you're a Christian, good or bad, that's a bad sign. Why? Because it means by your walk, your everyday walk, you look like a non-Christian. They can't recognize any difference. Bad sign. Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. Renewing of your minds? Yes. How do you renew your mind? By testing it. This is what everybody does, but is it the right thing? You're not asking yourself what is the right thing. You're bringing it to God. You're saying, God, is this the right thing? I'm comfortable with it, but that doesn't mean that it's right. The world is doing it, but it doesn't mean it's right. I got to check in my spirit. I guess it's wrong. I got to do the right thing. Even if I'm comfortable with doing the wrong thing, I've got to do the right thing. Yeah. Because I am what I do. Be not conformed to, be transformed to the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. See, so it's all about what God does. So you don't do what you do because you feel like doing it. You do what you do because the Holy Spirit directs. Now, when you start your Christian walk, you could be asking a lot of questions, and God does not mind. In a sense, Oswald Chamber talks about it being kind of a hampered walk, kind of like an invalid walk, because you can't do anything without asking God first, because you just don't know. There's so much in the world that is comfortable and wrong. There's so much in the world that is comfortable and evil, because the world has rejected Jesus. And guess what? We were raised in the world. So it's easy to take that walk. But in the end, we come back to what it says in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. That we may prove. Prove to whom? What is that good, acceptable, and perfect will of God? Not to us. We don't need to prove it to ourselves. The Holy Spirit bears witness. That's the proof that we have. We prove it to the world. Why? Because we do the right thing and they see the Spirit on us. And it convicts the world. So sometimes people are going to say, wow, that's great, you actually stood up to do the right thing. But other times people are going to say, who do you think you are? What makes you think that's the right thing? It's going to be rebellion, it's going to be anger, because you just made them recognize their own evil. And in the process of them recognize their own evil, they're not going to be happy. They're not going to be happy about the fact you just pointed out that they're wrong, that they're evil, and that they have no God. I'm a good person. I go to church. I go to Wednesdays. I pay tithes. And what part of that makes you good? Nothing. Because the Bible itself says, Jesus said, there's no one good but God. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So if we're all evil, all we can do is serve him. You know, it's like Jesus spoke the parable about, okay, so you have a servant. He's busy out in the field and he works all day and he comes in. And you say, okay, prepare me dinner and then you can eat. He said, do you thank that servant because he did what you told him to do? No. He was paid to do that. You don't thank people to do what you pay them to do. It's their responsibility. And we've been bought by Jesus by his blood. He died on the cross for my sins. He bought me in the slave market of sin. Cleaned me off. Gave me liberty in the Holy Spirit. Why would I want to go back to the life of slavery and sin? I don't. So it means I got to make sure that I'm looking towards him to keep me out of that, because naturally, like a pig goes to mud, I'm going to go back to that unless I'm looking to Jesus. I have to have my mind transformed. Otherwise, it will conform. So every day I got to make that effort. I have to be transformed. Help me, Jesus, to be transformed, to walk in your peace every day. And how do I stay in your peace? By staying in his will, by staying in his presence. Because as soon as I step out of that will, it's like stepping out of the shade into the sun. You feel the heat. You want to get out of that. You know, as long as you've got peace and you're flowing in that, you're doing the will of God, that's what he died on the cross for. So that I can be in his presence, so that I can be an extension of Jesus Christ in the earth. He can walk through me, he can talk through me, he can touch people's lives through me. He can inspire people through me. I don't have to do things. People are going to inspire. When we were in Cabo, a guy just walks up and starts talking to my wife and I about how it was such a testimony to him. He thought it was just great. He said, all the young people here should be asking about the nature of the relationship you two have. We've never met this guy before. But I thank God that that's the kind of testimony my wife and I have. We didn't go out to do it. We didn't go out to impress anybody. We were just sitting in the shade, holding hands and talking. That's all. My wife thought he was going to come to sell us something. I guess we sold him something instead. It's all about Jesus Christ crucified. Now we come back. What happens? And they stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing he'd been dead. Howbeit his disciples stood around about him. He rose up, came into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. You can't tell me they didn't know he was dead. It's like, oh, he looks dead, but I guess he wasn't dead. It doesn't work like that. You get hit in the head. I mean, he must, to look, even if he wasn't quite dead, although I believe he was, he tells the experience where he's caught up into the third heaven. That doesn't happen. But anyway, to at least look dead, he was pretty beat up with stones, getting hit in the head with stones. And he had a problem after that. He had a problem with his speech. He had a problem with his eyesight, which are acknowledged in the epistles that he wrote. Couldn't see properly, which means he couldn't write properly. He couldn't speak properly. God said his grace was sufficient. And God used that to bring his ministry to a whole new level. It's all about Jesus. It's all about Jesus. Now, this is the price that he had to pay. He had no problem paying it. But he couldn't die before his time. Can you imagine getting stoned to death, not with drugs, stoned with real stones? So bad that you at least looked at if you really aren't. Of course, I believe he was. And yet, he gets up after that and walks off. No complaints. Like, you gotta have at least some sores out of this. It's like, headache, whatever. It's like, no. It's all about what maintained him, what sustained him. The blood of Jesus.
Amen.
His walk with Jesus Christ, not the people around him. If he would have got into pity party, then he would have had a problem. He just like nothing happened, picked himself up, took him off, went about his business. That's salvation. That is discipleship. And that's my message today.